Welcome to another edition of In Conversation with Property Week. This week we have Phil Westerman, a partner at Buzzacott, the chartered accountancy practice. Phil, welcome.
Thank you, David.
Big topic, so let's get started. Probably the biggest question of all, just a general one. How are the issues of the UK economy affecting property sector at the moment?
It is a big question. There's, I think, an underlying theme at the moment that's built on a huge amount of uncertainty in the UK economy, global economy, that's been driven by various sort of factors in terms of, we ran Brexit into COVID, and then obviously the conflict in Ukraine, political instability, and all leading to that general uncertainty in the market that is having a direct effect on all aspects of property in the UK.
I mean, we've heard a lot about inflation, impact on interest rates, impact on supply costs in the sector. If you could pick one of these sort of bad news headlines we keep reading, which one would you go for?
That's challenging. There's I think it does depend to a degree on who you're talking about in terms of whether you're a property investor, landlord, or a tenant, or a developer, or an individual looking at home ownership. But I think if you take the sort of commercial sector, the combination of interest rate rises that have happened and are predicted to increase still further is really adding to that uncertainty over sort of viability of projects and ability to finance those projects. I think looking at the tenant side and the commercial property sector in particular, the impact of rising costs, inflation impacting on wages and general costs of doing business is making businesses look very hard at their own viability, and that in turn then leads to higher uncertainty over affordability of real estate and property. For developers, I think it's a combination probably at the moment of inflation, inflationary pressures, and the supply chain issues that they're experiencing in terms of both scarcity of resort to deliver the projects, and in particular for a developer looking at a longer term project where they've perhaps entered fixed price contracts for a build or a new development and have a variable cost base that is only going up, and that is quite clearly impacting on projected margins of the projects they're delivering, and again the viability of those projects.
Are we talking all firms across of all sizes, or is this difficulty to gain lending these days affecting any particular sort of sized firms? I'm thinking kind of more small and medium sized firms.
Sure. Well, typically the larger firms have the larger corporates have stronger balance sheets, perhaps stronger existing relationships with lenders, more assets to give us security. So they will go perhaps into bat with a bit more confidence that they'll either be able to secure new additional funding or refinance existing facilities. Whereas at the smaller end, with perhaps either less liquidity, a smaller net asset base, a smaller number of assets on which to secure new funding, and the general view that there would be a higher risk profile associated with a smaller business, I think that there will be a difference in accessibility of funding depending on the size of the business.
What about the kind of wider impact as well? The general, we keep reading about it, the cost of living crisis. How are consumers changing spending habits, which are inevitable, and people are being hit? How is that going to affect kind of big business as well? And obviously the property business. Do you think there's almost certainly going to be a knock-on effect there as well?
Yeah, there will. I think if you look at the large property businesses, say the investors who are owning a lot of assets, in the cities or in the regional towns, they've got a reliance on consumer spending to enable the retailers to continue to trade, continue to generate the cash flow, and those retailers then impacts their ability to pay their rents to landlords, and impacts the whole conversation around affordability of rent, something we saw a lot of during COVID, where the balance of power, I think, shifted a lot from what was traditionally, the power base sat with the large landlords in terms of negotiating rents and negotiating agreements, to suddenly a situation where retailers were forced to go to the table and negotiate much harder, and landlords were equally forced to accept lower rents, rental holidays, give improved incentives for people to enable people to continue to trade. So yeah, I think there's a direct link between consumer spending, not in all industries, but certainly in retail and hospitality and the larger corporates.
And so if we look, obviously, retail, hospitality, residential, do you think we saw this coming at all? Because obviously things like BTR and PRS have been going great guns over the last few years. Do you think they may have overdone it, potentially, not foreseeing what might happen now?
Well, I don't know if they've overdone it. I think certainly, everyone knew about Brexit for a long time. COVID came as a surprise to everybody, certainly in terms of its initial impact and then longevity. And I don't think anyone foresaw the conflict in Ukraine and the impact that's had on the wider sort of global situation. Look, in terms of residential property, there's still a shortage of supply in the UK. There's still a high demand for residential property, which is still government backed in terms of increasing the housing supply. So looking at the sort of private rental sector, I think that there's a general view that whilst there will be a longer term impact of this sort of perfect storm of everything in terms of interest rates and inflationary pressures, I don't think that's necessarily going to hit for a period of time yet. Perhaps 2022, the outlook still looks relatively positive in terms of house prices. 2023 and beyond looks a little less certain when those impacts might well kick in and start to impact the sector. So for a developer, residential property developer, what will be the sort of value they can gain from the developments that are currently in progress at the moment, and how will that compare to what they currently would expect if things did continue to increase in terms of value?
Do you think there'll be, I mean, we've had it for decades, but do you think some of the larger house builders will maybe increase the amount they sort of deliberately tighten supply? It's something they've been accused of for decades. Do you think we might see a bit more of that?
I mean, potentially that's, I guess, one of those unproven things, because they would always argue that the government hasn't necessarily allowed them to have the latitude just to do as many developments as they want, in terms of the sort of planning regime and the difficulties and the pitfalls that they would view are put in their way. But I think the ability of even the larger house builders to dramatically increase the levels of supply is hugely hindered by those resource constraints we spoke about earlier in terms of the availability of a workforce to build them. Never mind getting through the planning process, which is still complicated and time consuming. And then the availability of resource in terms of material supply to accelerate the programme is limited, I think, at the moment.
We'll get onto the reasons for what may have caused that in a moment, but I just wanted to go, you've already mentioned it, but the kind of retail and leisure sector seems to me that, when people don't have, as much money in their pockets and they're struggling to pay for heating, I mean, I think everybody, no matter how wealthy or poor you are, has noticed how much your heating bills have gone up, or your energy bills have gone up, at least in the last month or so. When that's happening, isn't it retail and leisure that's going to be hit hardest?
Well, you would expect people to start making the cuts in the non-essentials. So yes, I think certainly hospitality will continue to struggle. Retail, likewise. And I think the other impact from a retail perspective is the shift that's happened and will remain to a degree in terms of online versus in-person retail, and retailers looking at their options as to whether they still require as many shops in either shopping centres, shopping malls, and out of town and in town, or on the high street.
So those companies with the huge shopping malls, we won't name names for the purposes of they can't talk to us right now, but those with the huge shopping malls, both in town and out of town, they should be looking at how they can mitigate against this over the next 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, I think so, and there's a slight again a slight market difference here, I think, in between. So if you're looking at shopping, out of town shopping malls particularly, you've got what would be described as, say, community-based shopping malls that are still actually performing relatively well, on that they are full of what you would call sort of essential retail, or largely full of essential retail,
The
versus
candlestick makers and all that sort of thing, the butchers, the bakers, all that sort of stuff.
and you know so Tesco's, Asda, Morrison's, all of those people who are sort of the often anchor tenants, and then on the retail side, Primark is a good example of where, you know, trading is still relatively strong. If you compare that, I think, with, let's say, a higher end shopping centre that is full of designer outlets and higher end fashion retail, that's more likely to be the area that people really cut back on in terms of the non-essential shopping that they would do. And a number of those retailers, as is well known, have struggled over the last couple of years in terms of just general trading levels.
Yeah. So moving to a sector, you kind of touched on it there as well, about online retail. The logistics sector has obviously been the booming sector over the past, 3 or 4, 5 years now. I can't personally see anything stalling that in particular. Can you?
Well, I think if you go back as little as 3 months, the general optimism in that sector was that the growth trajectory would certainly continue for a couple of years, and that was still demand outstripping supply, and lots of new warehouses or sheds were being, you know, put up across the UK and across Europe, and I assume the wider world as well, to meet that demand from some of the bigger logistics businesses. I think recent mutterings have started to question whether so many have been built now that is there really that growth trajectory still in place, and actually, you know, people are starting to ask a few more questions about whether there is now enough supply. That probably doesn't apply universally in all locations, but certainly in some locations, I think there are certainly mutterings at some of the biggest players saying, well, we've now got enough space, but people are still building them. You know, most of them, to be fair, are being built with end sort of landlord in mind rather than speculatively. But certainly speculative shed building, is that demand going to be there for that in 12 months' time? I think there's more questions now than there were 3 to 6 months ago.
No, that's a good point. But what about there seems to, for me, there's been a shift towards last mile. We had the big sheds going on for years. Now everyone's looking for small sheds 3 miles away from the door they're going to deliver the parcel to.
Yeah, and that will be a business opportunity for the agile businesses who can do more than just build a big shed, because, you know, if there is sufficient capacity there, then people will be naturally looking to tweak their business models to meet consumer demand for that, as you say, smaller space just round the corner, which is arguably a bit more accessible. And, you know, the increasing costs of freight generally and supply issues in the sort of transport sector will likely influence that, in that, you know, people would look for shorter distances rather than having to look at all the long haul.
I mean, we could go through every single sector. We could, you know, every single subsector, healthcare, whatever, but I don't think we'll have time. But I do want to just briefly touch on offices. What's your view of that? Is the working from home thing having an impact? Will the general economy have an impact? Is there enough grade A space around for the top occupiers? But where are you on offices in the next few years there?
Well, I think, you know, working in central London myself, I think there is still, I'll use the word again, some uncertainty about what the resting place will be in terms of the hybrid working that everyone is adopting, in terms of what percentage of a workforce will be back in the office across the course of a working week. And there's various views, and depending on the sort of sector that the tenant is operating in, to a degree, 40%, 50%, 60%, you know, up to maybe 75, 80% in some. But I don't think anyone's expecting 100% of the workforce to be back in every day in any offices. And we're seeing that, and you can see that in the sort of traffic patterns around London during a standard week, is that it's clearly not as busy. So that I think there was a hope and expectation that when COVID was sort of disappearing, or hopefully disappearing, that those patterns would become a bit more established and people would have that certainty they were looking for. I don't think we're there yet, personally. I think there's still uncertainty. I think there's still decisions to be made by occupiers, in offices, as to how much space they need, and importantly, what sort of space they need, because there's a very competitive environment in sort of professional services, for example, in London for people, and the appeal of an attractive, well set out, spacious, modern office that isn't, we could get 500 in, but we don't want to, because that's not an appealing place to work. And we don't need space for 500, but you might still want the same amount of space overall. But I think the impact on sort of property developers and refurb businesses is that those decisions are still being delayed by people, whilst we hit sort of a resting place in terms of a bit more certainty over how many people we need space for.
So we're looking, we've seen the trend in the top space. It's about making the office a welcome place to be, a place to that is set up for you to come in 3 days a week, have meetings with. So more meeting space, more open space, less desk space. That's it, isn't it?
Well, I think less desk space, and an awful lot of people now work with hot desking arrangements as opposed to fixed desks and fixed offices to reflect the mobility in the sort of the workforce. You hear a lot of people talk about the importance of the office for collaboration and for teams getting together and actually doing things in person, not necessarily because they can't do them over Teams, because actually that's part of working life, and it's part of the enjoyment of working life when you can get together with your colleagues and teams. That I think, and in lots of professions or businesses, the importance of being with perhaps newer members of the team for their development, which is a lot easier to contribute to in person than it is over a phone call or a Teams video call. So that demand and the requirements of the occupier it's been changing for years, I think, to be fair, but it's certainly been exaggerated by recent history, and I think the recognition that people could work from home versus not everybody liking working from home, certainly not all of the time. The new office will look very, very different to the traditional office of 3-4 years ago.
We've only got a couple of minutes left, but this is a nice, easy one for you. We've talked about all the various reasons behind, lack of labour, lack of staff, lack of rising cost in supply chains. We've got 3 reasons. We only ever hear about 2 of them from the government. We hear about COVID and war in Ukraine. The government never mentions Brexit. Do you think Brexit was one of the reasons?
This may be a personal view, but I would argue that it was the first one, particularly in terms of concerns over availability of labour and the ability of people to have mobility in where they worked, and migrant workforces and people coming to the UK to work, and construction, property development was a big employer of overseas workers, and the concerns at the point of Brexit or in the run-up to the actual event was that people wouldn't have as much flexibility and mobility, and therefore there would be a shortfall in workforce. So we don't hear as much about it. Is it old news? Almost certainly not. Is it having a prolonged impact? I would say yes, certainly. Has it been slightly pushed to the back of people's thinking by other more recent, potentially more significant things in the wider world that we're living in? Then yes, but it's certainly there as an impact.
Okay, last one. This has not been the most positive of chats. Give us something to give us hope. Where's the hope?
I think the hope is around the historic resilience of the real estate sector generally. I think the resilience of the British and the people who live and work in this country. We always come out for the other side. We always have done. It's like a cycle. We cope and we survive. I think well-run, well-governed real estate businesses will continue to be successful, and real estate will remain an attractive investment proposition for both UK private investment, overseas investment. It is an area that the government are supportive of in terms of, both infrastructure side and fit for purpose real estate and residential property. So I think the outlook it will be a tough couple of years, certainly, but there's no reason to think why we can't come out of the other side stronger and in a better place across that sector particularly.
Thank goodness for that, something positive. Phil Westerman, partner at Buzzacott, thanks very much for being in conversation with Property Week.
Thank you, David.